Chapter 20. "I'd say you've got some explaining to do," Dan said, taking his jacket off and pitching it over Malou's anorak. He took toque and gloves off and strode toward the sofa where he sat beside Malou. "So what is this all about? You've transferred our living room into your cabin, and now what?" Damiano smiled from the chair facing the couple. "I thought you might like to rest for a while before we talk about your new future." "What new future?" "The future will be whatever it will be. Neither Malou nor I have any control over what's going to happen, unless you've got a crystal ball in this little house of yours, have you?" "No, Dan, I haven't, but although I would have to agree with you in part, that your future may be out of your control, you are the perfect candidate to influence the changes that will inevitably occur in your life." "What changes are you talking about?" Dan questioned. "I've had a skiing accident and I'm out of the hospital, and I'll be returning to work as soon as I've finished a few sessions of physiotherapy. What's there to influence in what I know will be my future?" Sitting there, in his flannel trousers, grey shirt and black vest, Damianos looked perfectly at ease with his surroundings. He chortled. "All true, except for one small but important detail that you have admitted to mention in your description of the situation." "What detail?" Malou asked, opening her mouth for the first time since Dan came through the door of the cabin. "I was there when Dan was discharged." "And so was I, Malou. But that happened the way it did when you revisited your past, didn't it?" "So?" Dan was switching his gaze from Malou at his side to Damianos, wondering what he had forgotten while he was in hospital. "Yes, it was during our visit of our past, but I don't recall anything being different this time," Malou ventured. "Well, the one that you and Dan seem to have set aside as an inconsequential detail is the fact that you, Dan, suffered a cerebral hemorrhage as a result of hitting your head against a tree during your fall." "But the doctor said that he sutured the vein that has been damaged," Malou argued. "Yes, he did," Damianos agreed, "and yet you were still in a coma when I came onto the scene." "But I wasn't," Dan said, raising his voice. "I was aware of everything that was happening around me. Or—" "That's because, when I grabbed your leg during my first visit, I actually woke you from your coma to enter the world of your imagination, Dan." "But what has that got to do with us finding acceptance right now?" Dan asked, getting visibly worried. "It has plenty to do with it, Dan. You see, while you are here in my world, time has stopped for you and Malou, and you're here to learn how to cope with the minor cerebral damage the hemorrhage may have done to your brain, whereby you would have to re-educate yourself into walking across the room, much in the same way as you did before you came through this door." "Oh my God," Malou blurted. "Do you mean Dan has come out of his coma, unable to function normally?" "Not quite, my dear. You see, and as I mentioned to you on a couple of occasions, you are spirits in my charge, and I need to guide you out of your deplorable situation as best I can." "Are you saying that you beating me with your cane was a test to see if I could endure the pain of walking again?" "Partly, yes, Dan," Damianos replied. "And what's there to accept then?" Dan asked. "Except for the possibility that I could be a paraplegic for some time before I can find the strength to walk again." "Aha, I see that you're endeavouring to encapsulate your fate in one small sentence. Very good. But in such eventuality, would you be prepared to accept the endless hours of physical pain against an uncontrollable mind? Would you be prepared for the frustration you would feel after each physiotherapy session?" Damianos fixed his gaze on Malou. "And would you be prepared to accept Dan's outburst of temper and interminable complaining, his irritable behaviour, his snapping at your children?" "I know I wouldn't snap at the kids, for one thing," Dan countered. "I've never done that, and will not start now." "All right, then," Damianos said. "That's progress. But what about your frustration? Both of you will be subjected to it, and its consequences for months on end. Are you prepared to direct your determination and stubbornness towards the path of your recovery?" "All we can do is try," Malou put in, shaking her head. "No, my dear, that's not enough. As I said to Dan when he was trying to get up, trying is not good enough. But doing away with whatever provoked frustration or intolerance is. You both need to accept the hand that you have been dealt and tolerate the consequences of the inconvenience deposed upon you." "And if we deny or ignore the situation, frustration and anguish will set in. Is that it?" "Yes, Malou, that's exactly what I needed you to hear and understand." "So what do we do now?" Dan asked. "Now we will have tea and biscuits as I promised, and then you will need to leave." Although time stood still for Dan and Malou once they left the chalet after they supposedly had tea and biscuits with Damianos, an interlude they actually couldn't remember occurring, it took them another hour to find their way back through the forest. It seemed to be an endless trek, even though when they came through the woods to find Damianos, it had been a very short and easy hike. "Do you think we got lost?" Malou asked, hanging to Dan's arm while walking heavily through the snow that blanketed the forest floor. "I don't think so, hun, but it certainly seems to take much longer now than it did when we first came through here." "Maybe that's another task," Malou suggested. Dan shook his head. "Unless we've read the book and we were not aware that we were doing it, I don't think this is another task, no." A gust of wind engulfed Dan's last word and forced them to close their eyes against the flying snow and leaves that lashed at their faces for a few minutes. When they finally reopened their eyes, they were standing in the long shadow of a dune in the middle of nowhere. The forest had disappeared, the hill and the house were gone, and nothing but the halo of an oasis in the far distance was in sight. "That darned cat has done it again!" Dan shouted to the infinite serenity of the landscape. "I swear to you, Malou, if we ever return to Pahokee, paraplegic or not, I'll throttle him with my bare hands." Malou giggled at the thought and turned her head toward the oasis. "It doesn't seem that far, do you think? Unless it's another one of Damianos' mirages, an unattainable destination, as he seems to put consistently across our path. On the contrary, I think it's quite attainable," they heard Damien's voice say behind them. Startled, Malou and Dan swung around to find the couple smiling at their bewildered faces. "I should have known that you'd be here to meet us," Malou said, all smiles now. "But look at you, Solangi. You look absolutely divine in that outfit." "Well, I must admit, white always suited me, and this jalaba is really comfortable in this heat." Once again, peering down at their attires, Dan erupted in loud laughter. "If we look like these nomads of the desert, look at us," he said to Malou. "Damiano should come to our house at Halloween. He would be a hit with the kids in their costumes." "That may be an idea, but I think it's time for us to walk to the oasis, everyone," Damien interposed gently. "The sun will set in a couple of hours, and we don't want to travel in the dark." "What about the book? Where is it?" Malou asked, suddenly realizing that neither Solangi or Damien was carrying it. "It's in the tent in the oasis," Solangi replied. "Nothing to worry about, dear." Yet Dan and Malou were worried. The distance separating them from the oasis seemed to grow with each step they took, until fatigue invaded them and resilience nearly abandoned them. "This is much farther than we've ever imagined," Malou said, beads of sweat purling on her forehead. "A tall glass of water would be quite welcome right now." "Make that a bucket of it," Dan rejoined, looking ahead of them, to see if the palm trees surrounding the oasis were any nearer than they were an hour or two earlier. They continued walking until they could no longer stand and began crawling to their destination. When Malou looked around to see if Solangi and Damien were still following them, they weren't. She stopped. "Do you realize we're all alone again?" she said to Dan. "They're not behind us anymore." "Damn it!" Dan swore as he turned his head to see only dunes of sand surrounding them. "I guess there's no better time than the present to apply what that darned cat taught us." "You mean being tolerant of our circumstances and accepting our situation while we fight to reach knowledge and truth, like the book said?" Malou asked. "Exactly," Dan replied, sitting down beside Malou. "We're here in this desert because we need to tolerate the heat and accept this situation for what it is, before we can take another step toward that oasis." As he pronounced the words associated with tolerance and acceptance, Dan and Malou felt themselves being transported near a tent in the middle of the oasis where Damien and Solangi were waiting for them. "Wow, that was like floating on a flying carpet," Malou said, regaining her balance after being dropped into the sand in front of the tent. Dan looked around him first and then at the inside of the tent. The latter was lavishly decorated with carpets and numerous cushions strewn about the place. There were copper plates on the floor, drapes separating the various sections of the tent, and a couple of camel saddles awaiting them. Amazed, they took tentative steps toward the saddles and sat down between Solangi and Damien. "This is like taking a trip through a series of fairy tales," Malou remarked, her eyes travelling to the canopy stretched over their heads. "If I had a camera, I would take pictures of every place we visit. The kids would love it." "But your camera is in your memory, dear. You might forget your stay with us or the reasons for which you were here, but you will retain the pictures of the places you have visited during this journey in your memory." "What about Damianos? Will we remember him as the cat we saw in Pahokee, or him in his many disguises?" "He will only be the cat he is in your memory, Dan. All those disguises, as you call them, are not really disguises per se, but characters in your imagination. And perhaps the one that will matter the most for you during this adventure is the shepherd you met in your last task." "Solangi is right," Damien rejoined. "The salient facts and the people you meet will probably remain with you after you return to 2013. "But tell me something, Damien," Dan said. "Will what happens during this trip change what we've become, or were, I should say, in 2013? "Only if you wanted to change any part of your future, Dan," Damien replied.